Thanks so much, Sophie. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our second industrial webinar of the year. There's a return on investment for an energy manager. And today's webinar will be discussing how companies have justified the hiring of a dedicated energy manager. And additionally, Gail will be presenting some of his research that backs up that there are quantitative savings to having a full-time energy manager. Next slide, please. We do have a couple of announcements. The Energy Star Industrial Annual Meeting will be held from the 23rd to the 24th of September at the Music City Center in Nashville, Tennessee. And as always, it will be held the 2 days before AEE World, which will be held the 25th to the 27th of September at Music City Center in Nashville as well. You should the industrial partners should have received an email to register for the annual meeting, as well as for 2 plant tours that we will be holding on Wednesday, the 25th. One at a Brown-Forman distillery in Tennessee, and the other will be at a Nissan automotive plant in I forget specifically where it is, but it's in Tennessee as well. So you can register for those tours and for the industrial annual meeting through those links that you should have received. If you haven't received those, please do not hesitate to reach out to myself, Betsy Dutrow, Danny McRae, or Kate Moody, and we will be more than happy to provide you that link. So next slide, please. And we do have a little bit of background before we get into the meat and potatoes of today's webinar. Today's speakers will be James Chadwick, and he's the energy manager for Georgia Pacific, and Gail Boyd, who is a research professor at Duke University and a member of the Energy Star team. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to James and for his half of our webinar today. James?
Cool. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Again, thank you for joining the call. My name is James Chadwick, and I am the Energy and Sustainability Leader for Georgia Pacific. And I have been in this role. I've been with Georgia Pacific for just shy of 3 years. And I actually took over this role from Mike Eunice, that some of you may know, last August, September of last year. So I've been in this role for about 9 months. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this topic of the return on investment of an energy manager. So just a little bit of background about Georgia Pacific. So Georgia Pacific company is a private company. It's actually owned by Koch companies, which is Charles Koch. So very large private company in the US. Other similar companies are Flint Hills Resources, Case Fertilizer. There's a number of others, and we are all underneath Koch. So very much the similar values that we come to, and I'll get into that. But Georgia Pacific as a company, we have a number of different divisions. So building products, I think you will see when you go to the large home improvement stores, you'll see our lumber, drywall, other products that you see there. So that is on our building product side. We have a cellulose division that make pulp. So basically similar to a pulp and paper process. That are used in the manufacturing industry, things like baby diapers and other industrial applications. Consumer products, which are a lot of the hygiene products, and you can see there, so that's tissue, towel, napkin, Quilted Northern Angel Soft, some of the brands that you see in the stores that you go to that are actually under the Georgia Pacific umbrella of products. GP Pro, if you go to, if you are in public restrooms, you'll see the GP Pro on the towel dispensers, and that's our Motion brand. We also have packaging, which is one of our big customers is Amazon. So we do a lot of the recycled packaging, a lot of the mailers that we have out there. So we have a lot of growth in that area. And then obviously in our recycling, and then we have a Juno waste. I would encourage you, if you want to know more about what we produce, certainly you can go to the website, gp.com, and find a lot more information. The other thing that Georgia Pacific does that I should mention is that we do have obviously our paper plates, so the Dixie paper plates, and then the Smart Stock, the plastic cutlery as well that we do make. So as a company, we're about 30,000 employees with 100 plus facilities in the nation. So from a partnership with Energy Star, we've had a good long existing partnership with Energy Star, and we actually currently have 3 of our facilities that are Energy Star certified plants. That's 2 on the integrated pulp and paper side, and then 1 just pulp mill. We've taken 6 we've been awarded 6 top projects and 7 Challenge for Industry awards, and we actually have just recently received our 8th Challenge for Industry award from one of our other operating mills. And we currently have 25 of our facilities actively engaged in our Challenge for Industry. We are also under the umbrella of Coke, as I said, as a partner of the year, I think for 4 or 5 years with Energy Star. So we look to continue that relationship. So we talk about, and this is actually from our Coke company. So this applies to all of its sub companies. Our stewardship framework. So we've got 3 real pillars: environmental, social, and governance. And really that is to deliver long-term value and be kind of the supplier of choice for our customers and for our communities, and making sure that they're getting the most value out of our products, and we're kind of the partner of choice. So I want to just focus on the environmental priorities and kind of how an energy manager, how we're seeing it fall into that. So you can just see, and again, this is information off of Coke's website from our stewardship report, but really we look at innovation, energy efficiency, air quality, water, and responsible resource management. So I think when the company says that we are going to focus on these areas, we need to have a way of being able to make sure that we are actually trying to work within those boundaries to make sure that we're delivering on these commitments. So from an energy efficiency standpoint, obviously I certainly look at that area, but I'm also looking at water. So we're trying to incorporate water and energy. We use a lot of water in our facilities and our manufacturing process. And so making sure that we're using that resource responsibly and that we're eliminating a lot of the waste is very, very important. This is a further slide of how we've taken our kind of environmental stewardship from the Coke level down into the Georgia Pacific level. And again, this is available on our website. But really, we've broken it down into the 5 C's. Conserve, challenge, contribute, control, and connect. So really conserving is the amount of natural resource. Obviously, we want to get the most bang for our buck and not use as minimal amount of resource to get our product out the door. So that is obviously mining of, for example, from gypsum, but that is also landfill, minimizing the amount of material that we're putting into landfills. Obviously our challenge is that we want to be as efficient. So using technologies, using knowledge to be able to make sure that we are the most up to date and using the processes as optimally as we can. We want to make sure that we contribute, so making our goods and service that, you know, help people improve their lives, obviously giving so that they value our product. Control, obviously, from emissions. So I've talked a little bit about landfill, about minimizing that, but also about air emissions as well, which is something that obviously we want to make sure that we minimize. And then connecting, you know, is basically very important, that mutual benefit is so that we as customers, employees, suppliers, communities, government, regulatory partners, that we partner in, that we're all trying to achieve similar goals. Again, just, you know, I'm not gonna read this, but again, it's the Coke vision and then the Georgia Pacific vision, you know, and really we're striving to be a leader in managing its energy use and continuing its renewable energy, and it's in our complex manufacturing processes. One of the things that's important is that we use a lot of we use a split amount, about 50-50. So 50% of our energy is actually from renewable resources. So basically from the trees that are grown to make our paper products. So that is something that we try to use, whether it's the burning of the bark or it's the black liquor that we get out from the process that we use to you know, create the paper and get the byproducts and that out of the paper. So talking about the kind of the program that we've adopted, and again, I've inherited some of this, but I look to obviously, you know, taking what we've had and try to make sure that we continue and in improving where we can. So this flow chart on the right may look familiar to some. It was based very much on kind of Energy Star's template of an energy program for facilities or for companies. And really what we've done is we've sat back, and from a Coke GP perspective, we have principle-based management in the middle of the screen, and how we can basically mold those two cultures together and get it fit so that it talks into our internal culture and how we're thinking through it. So again, you know, we're going through an assessment. Senior leadership is key to having buy-in, and then getting a level of commitment from the sites. So over on the left-hand side, some of the things that we've really tried to do is, I've said, we've got a lot of facilities. So making sure that we have, my role is to collaborate and communicate and make sure that we're knowledge sharing between site to site. So we try to have a site sponsor, an energy champion, somebody that sits on the leadership at these sites, and then an energy site leader that is somebody more junior in their career that I can work with directly as a resource that can keep me updated on the information in the bottom part of this chart, where there's the actual actions of creating action plans for each facility, and as they're implementing the actions and observing and evaluating the progress, that they can keep in with me, and then I can leverage that and then communicate with other facilities on sharing of best practices, so that it's that collaborative effort. So it's really more of a bottom-up approach rather than that top-down approach. We've also tried to institute energy teams, not always formal, but at sites. Again, it's this bottom-up approach. It's getting people the information, the ideas of maybe salaried, hourly workforce, of what works, what hasn't worked, what is tried. And again, it's just that sometimes not everybody needs to have 20 or 30 years of experience in their set industry to have good ideas when it comes to energy management. And sometimes asking the different questions gets people to think differently. And then from a performance indicators, obviously we want to be able to track how we're doing. And we look at MMBTUs per ton of product. And then from a water intensity, we're looking at gallons per ton, as well as from a purchased energy cost. So that is natural gas, that is electricity that we're purchasing off the grid, something that we're actually going out and purchasing, not something that we're generating internally through our processes. So the impacts, obviously, from an energy manager. So on the right-hand side at the top, health, safety, environment, reliability, production costs. Some of the, similar things I think you can apply to many of the industries and many manufacturing facilities. And I'm just thinking, as I was putting this together, energy usage and water usage potentially could impact all of these in some way. So really, my thought process and why I would ask people that are on the call is think about how energy usage and water usage, how it might apply in your facilities and what impact it could be. And some of the things that I've looked at and we continue to look at is obviously waste elimination, electricity, natural gas. We use a lot of steam in our process, compressed air, water, trying to get the non-value added out of our systems. Obviously, I've mentioned collaboration, knowledge sharing between systems, developing and implementing best practices, important elements of multiple year plans. So some things you're not going to do, and I can give some examples, but if you're going to go and re-insulate part of your process, you might not do that on a one shot. You may take multiple phases to be able to do that. A lighting upgrade is another good one, but actually documenting it and actually getting it into the plans, into your budgetary plans, so that people know and understanding what the size of that prize is and what the benefit is very, very important. And I think it's critical that energy managers working with others can help not drive the ship, but help communicate and keep others up to pace about what the benefits are. Obviously, and then utilizing measurement tools, whether it's internal reporting, benchmarking, and then obviously we use sites that are signed up for the challenge for industry, monitoring how they're performing, and then the plant certification, obviously the EPI models that we have, and then ultimately, obviously, communication to leadership on the performance and the importance of it. One thing I haven't added in there is also measuring from a greenhouse gas performance about emissions. Obviously, for some of our projects, we look at projects and we do measure kind of the impact that it's going to have from that sustainability emissions standpoint. Cool. And then some other considerations. So I mentioned health and environment, reliability, production, financial. So just to expand on that a little bit. So minimize the hazards. So good examples are lighting upgrades. Lighting upgrades, we view as really light the place up, make it safe so people can see, make it the light level such that people feel comfortable, so that they're not straining their eyes, they're not in dark spots, they're being able to see the hazards, the potential hazards around them. Another one is we have steam systems. So making sure that our steam systems are healthy, we're getting our condensate out of our systems. So we're having traps, steam traps, making sure that it's more of the safety is the bigger play and the bigger priority, but making sure that there is a secondary benefit, which would be any kind of energy savings from changing out old style light fixtures with new LED, more energy efficient fixtures. From an environmental risk standpoint, obviously the greenhouse gas and air emissions. I talked about a little bit about projects or work that goes on about how you can monitor and reduce that. But there's also from an environmental risk, the customer preference. So one of the things that we look at and we're considering, and maybe, some people, obviously we've got our end user customers, the public that are going out, but a lot of the companies that we are doing business, which are our customers from a Georgia Pacific standpoint, have internal targets of meeting their own greenhouse gas emissions and reduction targets. And so they're looking at their suppliers to also help them in terms of reducing that. So we could, if they could produce from supplier A or supplier B is who they want to buy from, they may choose not to buy from a certain provider if it doesn't have the added bonus of some of the emissions. So some of those things, and I know that's pretty new, but and it's in its infancy, but certainly we have to be aware of that and understand what that potential impact could be. A reliability risk, obviously, a reliable plant is a safe plant, I believe, and so anything that you can do to reduce the amount of unplanned events, so compressed air system upgrades, steam system upgrades, making sure that things are running and operating as per designed, is important. And then obviously from a production standpoint, if you can get the benefit of either energy savings or efficiency that impact production rates positively, then that could be a benefit. So an example of that for us was on one of our Kmea digesters, which is where the wood chips get cooked to get the liquor out of the lignin out of the paper, out of the pulp. We actually insulated that and actually saw some steam savings, some energy efficiency savings, but also saw some rate improvements on that process. So that was a win-win from an energy standpoint, emission standpoint, as well as a production rate. And then obviously it all comes down to, financial as well, is that, obviously EBITDA, NIAT, ROC are some of the financial measures that we look to as we evaluate projects, and certainly as we're evaluating energy projects. One that I haven't put into that, that also is that when we look at capital projects and upgrades, we will also not just look at a simple payback, but we actually look at internal rate of return on that project itself and trying to understand what that is and the benefit of that. So finally, to sum up, I think that one of the things I would ask is that everyone kind of, what is the return? Well, consider these questions. What is the annual cost of an energy manager, site energy leaders, your energy management program for if you've got multiple sites, what does that all add up to? And then what is the cost of energy and water for a company? So what does your energy bill and water bill look like? And then if you were to save 10% reduction in waste usage of energy and water, achieving the challenge for industry, which many companies have done, and it's not really a stretch target for a lot of companies. When you look at the amount and you equate that to dollars, how many energy leaders' salaries could this pay for? So I think you'll find out you could probably pay for a number of energy leaders' salaries. So it is something that we need to focus on and continue to work on. So with that, thank you very much for attending. And I guess I will hand it over back to you, Andrew.
Thanks so much, James. And just as a reminder to everyone in attendance, we will be having a Q&A session at the end. So if you have a question for James and in the future for Gail, please put those in the chat and we'll address them in the Q&A session at the end. So now I'm going to hand it over to Gail Boyd from Duke University and also a member of the Energy Star team. Gail, take it away.
Okay. So there's a return on investment. Statistical evidence from plant level data. Hopefully that's not going to scare you. But those of you who know me know I'm a numbers guy. James has provided a lot of the context of how energy managers fit into the business. I'm going to talk about, whether we can answer the question, is there a return on investment for an energy manager? Of course, you can read right on the slide that I think the answer is yes. I'll say that this work was done jointly with a former student of mine who's now an associate professor at Wake Forest University. And we'll get the, do I have slide control, Sophie?
No, but do you want me to control your slides, or would you like to do that?
Well, why don't you just give it over to me so I don't have to keep saying the next slide.
Gotcha. Alrighty, you should have control now.
Okay, light it up. All right. So here's the legal disclaimer. Since the study was using data from the Census Bureau, which is legally protected data, it's treated just like tax data. The Census Bureau wants everybody to know that this is on me, not on them, and that they have reviewed all of our analysis, and there's no confidential information that's being disclosed in the numbers I'm going to provide today. And a little thank you to some of the other people who made this possible. So I'm going to start off with this idea that statistical evidence, numbers on energy efficiency, this evidence is actually kind of thin. This group really believes there are lots of opportunities. We have lots of experience based on our beliefs. But what happens to an individual energy manager or company is that experience is unlikely to be statistically representative. Do we know whether or not what we experience would generalize to a bunch of other people? We also believe that this is a solvable problem. We know there are new technologies that can be implemented, and we believe that energy management, like programs like Energy Star, really are the way to help solve those problems. But I'm the numbers guy, and so can we quantify those beliefs in a statistically meaningful manner? And in particular, this study tried to look at how much energy might be saved if you had an energy manager. So let's kind of the only way we can do that is to have the data. And in this case, we have data which is not publicly available. It's at the plant level. And it's we use the manufacturing energy consumption survey. It's statistically representative. Some of you may have filled out this form, and some of you have told me it's really long, and I looked at it too. And it's really long. It has lots of information, detailed information on the energy use, the cost, the value of shipments of the products at the plant. And then recently they've been adding questions about not just the numbers, but things like, do you have an energy manager? Have you conducted an audit? Do you have computer monitoring? Have you done a retrofit? And so since Duke has permission to use these census data to study energy efficiency, we took this data and we dug into this question about the energy manager. And I'll kind of jump to the end. Energy efficiency is very widespread. There's in every industry we've ever studied, there's a difference between sort of the poor performing plants and the good performing plants. And in some industries, this difference is pretty big. So there's a spread of performance, even when we have sort of narrowly defined sectors like comparing pulp mills or integrated paper mills like James was referring to. So using MEX, because it's statistically representative sample of data, and we looked at these two basic energy management practices, we found that having an energy manager on average results in a savings of about 6.5%. And our 90% confidence interval, in other words, we are 90% sure that the savings would be somewhere between as low as 1% and as high as 12%. So the savings are there. On average, it's about 6.5%. And since we had some of these other questions, this talk was billed as the energy manager talk, but conducting an energy audit results in about the same thing, about 7% savings with a 90% confidence of anywhere from 1 to 13%. So that's good news. So, how does energy management work to generate these savings? again, James provided some of the context of where an energy manager fits into the process. And so since we know some plants are performing better than others, is it the management that makes a difference, or is it something else? I mean, some plants good. Maybe they were just lucky and they had all the newest toys, and it really didn't have anything to do with energy management. So since we have data reporting from plants, whether they had a manager, an audit, monitoring, and retrofits, we can analyze the plants based on the answers to those questions. So more about the MEX data. I said it's statistically representative. It's conducted every 4 years. It's about 4,000 plants. If one of you in the audience has a large energy-intensive facility, your survey was probably set that plant. So it's not completely random survey, like the phone calls you get about the presidential election. This survey goes to almost all large plants in energy-intensive industries, and then a random sample of other ones. And then it has detailed information on the price and quantity, the value of your non-energy inputs, and the total amount of product you produce in terms of dollars, and then the management questions. So for this particular study, we looked at 2 snapshots of the SMEX survey from 2006 and 2010. This study was done a little while back, and those were the most recent years that were available at the time. So we can compare between those 4-year snapshots to try to get a picture of what energy management looks like. So how did the analysis work? We could just say, let's look at all the plants that have energy managers and all the plants that don't have energy managers and look at the difference. That's not likely to be very helpful, because if you're an industry that uses a lot of energy, or you're a high energy intensive industry, you're probably more likely to have an energy manager. So we have a chicken and egg problem here. We can't just look at the haves and have-nots and see the difference. We have to dig down a little bit further. So what we did was we looked at 2006 and 2010 and looked at the plants who basically said, well, in 2006, they answered no. And in 2010, they answered yes. I guess it's also possible that in 2006, they answered yes, and then the energy manager quit or got fired or something, and then so it switched. So, but we looked at plants where their questions had changed. And so that way, we're looking at every single plant and whether or not they experienced a change in their management practices in terms of having an energy manager. And then we did some other things statistically, which I'm not going to get into the weeds and put everybody to sleep on. But we wanted to make sure our estimates were really robust. So if we measured it a bunch of different ways and we kept getting about the same answer, then we'd be much more certain that we've got something here. And so we included other things like changes in labor use and materials use and changes in the total amount of production at the plant. And then for those of you who care about something like this, and most of you probably don't, we use something called a plant fixed effects statistical model to conduct the analysis. So, back to the preview here. Plants that added an energy manager experienced an average saving of about 6.5%, this range that we talked about. And plants that conducted an energy audit experienced the savings of a difference of about 7% with this range. Now, on the audit stuff, I think it's worth mentioning that the energy audits didn't say how much did people find, it just did you do one. So this 7% number is actually the realized savings, how much things changed. So it's not how much did the audit identify, but this is how much was a change between 2006 and 2010. I'll throw in that the plants that said they did a retrofit and an average savings of about 4%, that estimate was not as statistically precise as the other two, but I thought I would just mention that it looks like sort of technology retrofits in conjunction with the energy audits and the energy managers is certainly part of this story. Okay. So I want to be honest with you and talk about what we don't know from this study. Timing. We just looked at 2 snapshots, and we don't know, did these savings continue year over year, right? So that's just the nature of the particular data analysis that we did, where we just looked at those 2 years. We also don't know, say, for example, when did they do that audit, or when did they hire that energy manager? Did they hire the energy manager in 2007, or did they hire the energy manager that year in 2010 when the survey was filled out? So there's we don't have that detail in terms of, we just know it happened sometime during that window, and that may account for the range in the estimates, the statistical uncertainty, because we don't know about the timing of it. What we also don't know, and it was kind of, maybe, I won't say it's misleading in the slides, but this actual notion of return on investment, and James referred to that in his last slide. How much could you save? How much it's going to cost? And what does the energy manager cost? That's really getting it into where the rubber hits the road on the financials. So our study did not try to convert the percent energy savings into dollars. And we really don't have information in the survey about how much an energy manager would cost. Now, you all could take that 6.5% number, and your results may vary, as it says in the analysis, but they could give you an idea of, this is what I might expect if I had an energy manager. What is my energy spend, and what would that person cost me? And that, you start to get something that's going to put on a scale to begin to ask those questions. Just like James said, hey, if we can get 10%, like the challenge, how does that stack up to the cost of an energy manager? What we don't know but might still learn is, the good news is that Next has actually added more energy management questions to their survey since 2010. They're beginning to ask questions like, is the energy manager part-time or full-time? And let me back up a minute. James talked about site leaders and champions and teams, and in this MEX survey, it just said, do you have an energy manager? They didn't define what that was. In more recent surveys, they've said, do you have a full-time one, or is it part-time? And then they gave you like 20, 40, 60. They gave you some numbers about how part-time it is. They've added some stuff on the audits. Like, is it in-house? Is it third party? Is it utility? Does the source of the audit matter? That might be interesting, because if people are thinking about, hiring a third party or getting involved with the utility, is there statistical evidence of, or does it matter at all? There's questions on, do you participate in Energy Star or ISO, or do you use simple payback criteria? Do you have sub-metering? What types of goal settings do you use? So there's more data points out there that we're getting on, on energy management practices. And so we might be able to learn more about what we would expect if some of those things are implemented, and what kinds of savings on average that they might generate. So statistically speaking, an energy manager leads to reductions in energy use, anywhere from 1 to 12%, somewhere between 6 and 7, and a similar sized impact observed for energy audits. The way the analysis was done, we don't think that those two numbers are very similar, but they're not overlapping. So in other words, having an energy manager and doing an audit bumps that number up. So we couldn't do combinations of different, do you have this or both? We didn't quite have the data for that, but the way that we did the analysis, it suggests that they may not be mutually exclusive, but they probably are additive and would combine. So with that, I will say I'm happy to take some questions. For those of you who actually like to read stuff, this was a paper that we presented several years ago at the ACEEE Industrial Summer Study. And if you wanted to see it on paper, you can certainly get a hold of me and ask for a copy of it. But I'll just kind of go back and say, people got questions? I don't know if I have answers, but we'll certainly try.
Thank you so much, Gail. I'm going to echo what Gail said. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Please feel free to put them in the chat, and we will do our best to address them. I'm not going to say we will address them, but we will certainly do our best to address them. Okay. We do have one from Jim. Uh, Thank you for sharing this great work. It seems like the 6.9% average from an audit compared to the 6.4% savings from an energy manager could be misinterpreted to give the impression that an audit survey is more valuable tool to the energy manager, which I'm sure is not your intent.
You're right. It's not. This was just, I'm throwing statistical analysis at you, trying to hang some numbers on some of these different energy management practices. The data didn't really allow us to look at combinations of changes in, like, you did an energy manager and an audit. You only did an audit, and so the way we did the analysis is certainly suggestive that these things would be cumulative. I think we all know, and kind of from James's presentation, just doing an audit and not having somebody around to make sure stuff gets done is a good way to just have, a doorstop, which is this big report that says all the things you should have been doing, or what Fred Schoenberg used to talk about, cashing the check. So no, we don't know. I'm not trying to give the idea that, I guess the thing is, it kind of comes back to when senior management says, why should we hire an energy manager? What's it going to do for us? That was at the crux of this question. And the same thing is, why should we bother with one of these audits? Both of these analyses suggest that there's a return, and it's statistically, it can be statistically measured, and it's not small. So it's not to say that one's better than another, and maybe you should do both, and you can get 14%.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Gail. We do have another one from Don. I'm assuming this one is for Gail. Do you have an estimate of the number of companies who either added or removed an energy manager between the two snapshots?
Yeah.
And an estimate of the total population of reporting companies, yeah.
Yeah, so every single number I showed you had to go through a census clearance process. So we did not, off the top of my head, I don't recall clearing a number. I don't remember a number off the top of my head. And it might, if it's in that paper I mentioned, I could go look it up, but I don't think we did. I don't think we I don't think we went through the clearance process to quantify that and be able to release that number from the Census Bureau. I will say that because we did the sample of the number of people who changed from yes to no had been really small, then we would have had a hard time getting a very statistically valid estimate. So I'm kind of hedging my things, like I can't give you the number, but if it had been really small, I don't think we would have had much statistical power in that estimate to even be able to consider it valid. But that is a good question, and it's probably, if we do more of that, then we would probably want to be able to talk about how many people changed this. Census, the MEX does produce numbers that basically says, how many people answered this question, yes or no. But we could have some people who had one and then didn't have one, and vice versa. So it's in the MEX published data, but I'll just go back to, no, I don't recall releasing that number from the Census Bureau. So even if I could remember it, I probably shouldn't say it. Population of reporting companies, like I said, MEX is about 4,000 plants every year. That's statistically representative. It is certainly true that part of that sample is random. So our data only comes from the plants that were in the survey both years. And I don't remember what part of that sample is like the always sample versus the random part of the sample. That information is in the MEX survey documentation on EIA, and I could probably find it. But that is another good question. But it is certainly true that our analysis only is of plants that were in both years of the survey, because that's the only way we could do the comparison. And so it's going to lean more toward the bigger energy users.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Gail. I have a question for Gail and or James. Can you speak to the value of energy managers that bring in utility incentives, demand response payments, or other revenue streams related to energy management? And James, I think this might be more of a you question, but Gail, you're more than welcome to put in your 2 cents as well.
Yep. I'll throw James under the bus on that one, because that's not something that we've had a way to look at.
In my time, I've seen limited. I've heard about it. I think that any project, depending on the geographic location, a lot of it is the incentives that are out there. That can be something that is kind of very beneficial to whether a project is going to be valid. So if you've got a utility company that would give you a rebate on lighting, I think the value of an energy manager is they're going to have the time and the time and the ability to be able to seek out these opportunities. So some of the time people go out and do these projects and aren't even aware of it. So I think if anything, these bolster projects and help justify some of the projects. I certainly know from my experience of hearing some of what we've done internally with GP and Coke, that certainly helped it. Obviously, some of the other projects that we've done or we're looking into is tax incentives as well. They just basically make the economics of the project a little bit more attractive, so that when you go and have discussions with leadership, it's more attractive. Hopefully that answered that question.
Thanks so much, James. We have one quick question here from Tom for Gail. What is the time frame of the savings due to an energy manager? For that, I think he's referring to that 6%. Is that 6% over 4 years, or is that?
So yeah, that's the change, the level change that we saw in the snapshot within those plants across the 4 year. That's why I talked about the timing of it and the sort of range of uncertainty around the level of those savings. If it's on average 6% over 4 years, it's like 1.5% per year. But depending on when that process, the energy manager came on board in that window, that might account for the variability in those savings estimates. And then also we don't know if that sort of continues, thereafter. So you have an energy manager, you've added one, do plants continue to go down? That's another issue of not just sort of, do they have a step change, but is it sort of a growth rate change? We did not look at that. And that's certainly something that's worthwhile, because, we want to know, in the long term, is the energy manager going to, keep delivering savings? I think anecdotally, and maybe James can speak to this, one of the things that I think we've heard from other partners is that if you don't keep after stuff, then the savings that you've implemented end up eroding and going back the other way. And so just keeping up with the stuff that you've done is, I think anecdotally is also the role of the energy manager. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think as technology changes, so lighting upgrade, I'll go back to that. We went from halogens to HIDs, and now we're going to LED. So we're actually replacing things. So we actually may have had a incentive for upgrading originally, and now we've got another incentive for upgrading. So, I think it's a constant evolution as technology changes, that you're always going to be looking to seek out the best opportunities and the value. And yes, I do believe it's like low-hanging fruit, right? You can go and pick all the low-hanging fruit, but as people say, it grows back again. And I think that's the same thing with the waste in your energy systems. It will come back if you don't actively manage it.
Absolutely. Thank you both for your answers. I think we have two more questions here in the chat. This one's from Denise for both of you. The team sometimes sees the energy champion as solely responsible for job responsibilities they deem to be associated with energy. What did you do to get the team to work in conjunction with the energy champion or manager and accept that they have responsibility as well?
That's a James question. You know, he's been on the inside of this. I'm on the outside looking in.
I think collaboration. I think that you've got to have communication. You've got to be visible. You have to go to the plants. You have to sit down with people. And I think you've got to understand the knowledge process, the comparative advantage that they have, and their motivation for doing it. So I think you have to look, and everybody's going to be slightly different. But it's something that you just have to kind of keep beating the drum and keep going back to people and trying to paint that picture. And I think from myself, where I go to the multiple sites, the first question that I ask is, hey, not that I'm going to save you this much money, or why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? It's more of a question of, tell me what you're working on, what's important, what do you think important? And then in my mind, I'm trying to bring back to, how does that think about energy? And then ask them, how do you see energy fitting into these priorities? Because we've all got a lot of priorities, but also it's sometimes that we have to make sure that we understand where energy is a component of those, as I touched on in my presentation, but also understand that once you identify that there is a value, somebody's opportunity cost is appropriate to go after that amount of value as well. So it is important, but yes, it can be something that is takes a lot of communication with people.
Excellent. Thanks so much, James. And I believe this is our last question. If you do have any questions for our panelists, now's your chance. This is from John. Are the savings numbers normalized using some metric, or just absolute savings numbers from year to year? I'm assuming that's for Gail.
Yeah. So we did it a bunch of different ways. We did a bunch of statistical models to see whether or not our results were very robust. It's best to think of this really as normalized. In particular, you can think of because there's the diversity of plants, it's normalized to total sales. So energy use per dollar. We included in the analysis also things like changes in labor and changes in materials use to see whether or not accounting for some of the other things that might be going on in the plant that we had data for, we might get a very different number. Well, we didn't when we included some of these other metrics. But yeah, it's best to think of these estimates as accounting for changes in the activity of the plant. In 4 years, hopefully, I mean, everybody who's in business hopefully is thinking their sales are going to go up. And I'll add, since we're using dollars as a denominator, those were dollars that were adjusted for inflation as well. So there were, an economic measure of real gross output.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Gail. Looking at we do have one last question from Ruben. Was there any work on how much money is required to reduce the energy of a site by a percentage? Say, for example, utilities are $10 million a year and $250K was invested to reduce the utility costs by X%.
So we did not have any information in the MEX survey, so like on the retrofit question, it just said, did you do one? It didn't say, if you did one, how much money did you spend? census collects information on investment at the plant. But as you all know, and the fights continue, most of the investment dollars at the plant aren't going toward energy. It's going toward everything else. And so that's, trying to analyze that is kind of trying to, analyze with a pretty blunt hammer, how much investment at a particular plant changes the energy use, because we don't have things that are specifically in energy investments. So the short answer to the question is no, we don't have data for that. And that's when we end up going back to a lot of the anecdotal case studies, energy audits, kinds of things that can demonstrate, what are the costs of different types of, technical system upgrades, and what are the internal rates of return compared to the energy savings of those kinds of investments. And we see in like top projects and lots of things over and over and over, the internal rates of return on these things are really good. So we have lots of anecdotal evidence of that, but the statistical data that we have on that, statistically representative data that exists, doesn't have anything that would allow us to look at that.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Gail. Seeing that there are no questions left in the chat, thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and thank you so much to our panelists for sharing your knowledge. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day and will continue to have a wonderful day. Thanks so much, everyone. We're going to end the webinar here. And thanks so much, Gail and James. I really appreciate it.
Cool.
My pleasure.
Thank you.